welcome to Rural Assembly Everywhere. This is a great chance for us to talk with two powerhouse scholars, Kathy Kramer and Hahrie. Kathy is at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Go Badgers! She has been one of the co-chair people of the Commission on the Future of the Economy, and has worked with Rural Assembly and with Whitney Kimball Cole, who's on that commission. Hahrie and I served together on the Commission on Democratic Practices, so this is kind of like a reunion, and I'm glad to get a chance to talk with you guys. I think that your full resumes will be on display for all the assembly goers, so great. So here's a question I'd like to ask both of you guys. It seems like for 40 years, I don't know, it seems like every 4 years we're told this is the most important election for the future of our democracy. If we don't vote this way or that way, we're going to lose the whole shebang. And each time it seems as if the rhetoric gets ramped up. There's more invective, there's more passion, more anger, and all of a sudden for poor schmoes like us,
do you want to start, Kathy?
Some of it is just, Rick, right? To freak people out and scare them is a great motivator and a way to get people to the polls and get them to vote. And a lot of the challenges that people are facing are not new. It's not as if, say, the last 4 years or the last 8 years have suddenly brought, for example, like people's economic challenges about, right? I mean, people in rural communities, for example, have been a lot of folks have been really having a hard time making ends meet for decades, right? At the same time, I would say that the fact that Donald Trump it's not clear whether he will accept the results of an election, and the things he said about retribution to his political opponents once in office do make me wonder whether there is something to be said for this election is really important for the future of our democracy and the kinds of liberties that I think, myself included, have taken for granted for my entire life.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, let me just say that it's really nice to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. And I always love having a chance to talk with you, Dee, and always with Kathy too. And I largely agree with what Kathy said. I think, it is true that I think too often people use that sense of threat as a way of trying to motivate people to turn out. And to your point, it can kind of lead to this cycle in which people tune out because it seems like, well, they told me it's a threat last time and we're still here. And so why would I pay attention this time? But I do think there is something unique about the challenges in this moment, particularly because things that we had taken for granted for a long time in our democracy just aren't taken for granted anymore. Things like the fact that, we may not have, the peaceful transition of power. There's certain kind of norms about political violence and democracy that I think people had taken for granted for a long time that no longer seem like things that we can necessarily assume will be true. And so there's a way in which I think it feels to me, as Kathy said, that even though I resonate with the sense that there's a way in which the challenges aren't new at all and that the sort of rhetoric around threat is certainly not new, I do think there is something potentially unique about this moment. But then maybe the other thing that I'll add is I do feel like the kind of cycle that you're describing is a sign of the way in which this moment that we're living in the 21st century is just one of tremendous uncertainty. Like the structure of our economy is changing, the socio-political dynamics are changing, technology is changing. I mean, we just live in a moment in the world when like everything is changing at once. And I think our political system in a way is struggling to catch up. Or like a metaphor that I always have in my head is it feels like all the balls are up in the air all at one time, and we just don't know how they're going to land. And so everyone's trying to, like, people are kind of grasping for different ways to try to make them land a certain way. And I think because of that uncertainty, there's this constant feeling of like, wait, is this it? Or is this it? Or is this it? You know? And so I don't know that I know the answer to when it's actually going to be it in a way, but I do think that uncertainty is a reality that we have to live with in this present moment.
In a recent New York Times piece about how data is being used to look at rural voter rage and racism and rejection of the system, Nick Jacobs from Colby College said there's a real difference between rural rage and rural resentment. Kathy, you wrote the book on rural resentment. What's your take on that and the difference?
Well, I agree with Nick. I think, I mean, in my mind, resentment is this feeling that it's not new to Donald Trump, right? But this sense that uh, among many people in rural areas, I'm a rural person, and people like me, people around here, are working hard, and we're good people, and it doesn't seem to us that we're getting what we deserve, right? And we not in terms of stuff or money or resources, not in terms of attention from decision makers, and not in terms of respect even from people making those decisions. That's a kind of an undertone emotion. It's not necessarily rage or nastiness, but it can be turned into rage when the right politician comes along and says you're right to be so upset and you should be angry, and vote for me and I'll make America great again, right? And I think part of the undertone of that conversation, right, rage versus resentment, is the role of racism. So the White Rural Rage book that Times op-ed was in reference to, right, was saying, really, when you boil all that resentment thing down and you really look at it, it's really about racism, really, right? It's really about white folks in rural areas being racist, and that racism being fomented by candidates. And I don't want to downplay racism. I think racism is unfortunately a huge part of American political culture. But I would say that's not unique to rural areas. And I would say that the kind of resentment I heard in rural areas, that is this sense of, I'm not getting my fair share. I'm working my rear off, as is everybody I know, and still not getting ahead. Well, that's my sense of the difference.
Hahrie, I have a democracy question. You're the director of the Ed Gore Institute, the institute at Johns Hopkins on democracy. Go Blue Jays! And um, it seems to me that usually when we talk about democracy, we think about how we're registered or how we vote or how we govern or sometimes how others label us. But but 2 years ago here in Eastern Kentucky, we had this devastating flood. 46 people were killed, thousands were made homeless, and the acts of courage and heroism of people just coming out, and 1,400 people were saved from the water. People were nursed and nourished and sheltered, and it was done by locals. It was done by strangers. Nobody with any sense of wanting a dime or recognition in return. They just did it. I'm interested in what the underlying tenets of democracy are. Is it about helping our neighbors, or is it about uh, what's in it for me?
Yeah, I remember that flood. And I think that a lot of times when people think about what democracy is, the first thing that people think about is like, you know, Congress, like it's a building, where laws are made, and there's a structure, or it's a Supreme Court, and it has these like pillars in front of it or something like that. But in my mind, part of the reason why I became a political scientist and part of the reason why I was drawn to trying to understand and study democracy is, to me, democracy is the work of people figuring out like how we want to forge a common life together, and that's a really hard question to answer. Anyone who's been in a family knows that it takes a lot of work, to make the family work. And, and I've got, I have a partner and 2 kids, and, it's the 4 of us in our household, and the 4 of us are like, just figuring out like where to go for dinner, or what we want to have for dinner tonight, or where we're going to take a vacation. Like it's a discussion, let me tell you. And if you and we are all genetically related to each other, right? And so then if you take it and you sort of multiply that out to a large society where you have millions of people who all come from really different backgrounds, who some live in urban areas and some live in rural areas, and some people were born in the United States and some people weren't, and just on and on and on. And you think about all the differences, then how does a community of people at a small or a large scale do the work of forging a common life together? And that's why it is important to have like structures and institutions and places where we begin to channel some of that decision making. But to get to your question of what's at the heart of it, I think, to your point, like when communities across America are in crisis, what we see is people recovering something very human, right? Which is the natural instinct to want to help each other. And that's true whether you are like me or whether you're not like me, that people have this desire to want to help their fellow person. And we see that emerge again and again. And so I think in some ways, the challenge of our politics in a lot of ways is like, how do we build a system that allows those natural instincts to come out? Because right now, the system that we have, the 2 parties, the candidates, like, all the different kind of trappings of what we think of as formal democracy are not really working that well. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons why that happened. But that doesn't mean that at the heart of it, you don't have a group of people who really are trying to answer that question of what does it mean for us to be in community with each other, and what are the commitments we're willing to make to each other or not. I think that there's some very basic questions there that still animate the work of democracy, or at least I like to think that they do at its very best.
About a year ago, we were finishing up doing a series of polling rural voters and looking at messages that resonate, and then doing special kind of focus groups in different parts, different rural communities. And in some ways, what we found was that surprising. There was a kind of drift to the right by rural voters, but there were some things that I was surprised by. One was just what kind of economic populism we were seeing, and particularly how anti-corporate messages were resonating in rural areas, which I just was not ready for. And then in our focus groups, we heard these compelling messages, and the focus groups were focused on economic prospects. But let me just read you a few of these. This is from a participant in Ohio. If working made you rich, then day laborers would be millionaires. Just doesn't work that way. We listen to so much of this crap that poor people are indoctrinated with that. They carry that shame. Here's a participant from Wisconsin. There's a lot of loss in this room, and there will be. For those who haven't experienced it yet, they will. And here's a participant from Kentucky. The cavalry ain't coming. We're the cavalry. You have to make a stand and say, who's my neighbor out there? Him, her? I don't got much, but oh hell, for God's sake, these people got nothing. I'm interested in how much of democracy rests on the idea of one generation doing better than the last generation, of I need to do better, or I need to do better for my kids, or my kids need to do better. How much of the system that we believe in really depends on a sense of economic prosperity?
That's a great question. I mean, in some respects, it rests too much on that idea of prosperity, right? In the sense of you're a good person or you've done well if you have experienced what social scientists call like social mobility, right? Where you earn more than your parents did. Where a lot of folks, like in those focus groups, Dee, if I remember right, and like in the ones we did for our commission, people just wanted stability. Like Hahrie was talking about before, like this feeling of insecurity. They want to grow up in a place and get a job there and stick around their family like their dad or their grandma used to be able to, right? And so in some respects there's this myth of prosperity, like that's the good life, like you achieve. Well, I'm not sure that's what people really want. They just want stability. They want enough to have the good life, which for a lot of people means a job that doesn't take away their dignity and ability to be and have a little bit of time with their loved ones.
So if you'll forgive me for a second for being like a little bit professorial in answering this question, like, there's a political scientist at Cornell who I think she just retired. Her name is Valerie Bunce, and she's a definition of democracy that I really love. And she sort of says, democracy is unique among all other forms of government because it requires that people accept uncertainty over outcome in order to have certainty over process, right? So like, I don't know in any given moment if my guy's going to win the election, right? If my party's going to win the election, I don't know if the policy that I want is going to pass. I don't know if, exactly what the impact of whatever government does is going to be on my family's economic fortune or something like that, right? But that what differentiates democracy is I accept that uncertainty because there's a certain set of rights and responsibilities that I commit to, that make me want to stay in the process, which is different from if you think about like an authoritarian regime. Like if Russia has an election, like we know who's going to win, right? We know it's going to be Putin. So we know what the outcome is. We just don't know how he's going to get there, right? We don't know what the process is that's going to be to get there. So it's the opposite in other kinds of governments. And I think about that definition a lot in relationship to the question that you asked and what Kathy was just saying, because I think that I totally agree with what Kathy is saying. On the other hand, it's also true that like when we're asking people to do this really hard thing, which is to accept uncertainty over outcome, what happens when the range of outcomes we start to ask them to accept becomes too big, right? So if you're asking me to buy into a system where I may not know that my children are going to be able to have a healthy living, right? Or that I won't be able to feed my family, or that because of the color of my skin, I'm going to be threatened by the police, or like whatever the things are, then yes, I am more likely to withdraw from that system, right? Like it's a logical response when that range of outcomes becomes too broad. And so I think that what Kathy is saying is totally right, that, there are a lot of people who just that aren't necessarily kind of seeking, sort of constant advancement or just seeking kind of a stable life. But there has to be some sort of sense in which there's boundaries on how bad it can get, I think, and because of the uncertainty that we have right now, there are a lot of people out there who feel like, I'm not sure that, that I'm willing to accept how, the boundaries that you're asking me to accept. And I don't think that's totally unfair. And so it's, I think it's a work of government then to sort of narrow the range of outcomes that people are asked to accept, and for people to be able to have more voice in the process, so they feel like, like things aren't just going to happen to me, but I can put my hands on the levers of change.
Okay, I have a final question for you guys. So when Deb and Jim Fallows were doing their Our Towns work, book and television series, one of the things that intrigued me was the sense that they said that if they came into a town and asked what needed to be done, people would name the issues, and they would come together across lines and work together and laugh together and be good natured and figure out solutions. And if they came into a town and asked politically, what side are you on? That the community immediately divided. People went into their corners, and it was hard to get them to come back together for this communitarian purpose. So I'm interested in, one, kind of how divided are we, and two, how do we rebuild trust? How do you rebuild faith or consent of the governed?
In my mind, that's part of a bigger problem, I think, where too many people experience politics as spectacle, where it's like a game that I watch other people play, and it's almost like amusement, right? And I, every now and then, every 4 years, I get to go and I get to pick this candidate or that candidate, the same way that I go to the store and I pick, Hunt's or Heinz ketchup or something like that. And in those situations, it's no surprise then identities are categorical, right? Because we're just watching a game, and so it's like the red team versus the blue team, or the whatever the different teams are. And so I think what we really need to do is think about, how do we recreate a situation in which more people get to experience politics as experience, where identities aren't categories, but they are actual experiences that I have of other people, where, and it's, I think what I really liked about what the fellows were describing is that when you ask people how to solve problems together, like, people have natural instincts and habits and ways of coming together to figure out how to solve problems together. But we don't give people that opportunity, and not often enough, And so in some ways, I think the question is, how do we recreate a system where more people are invited into opportunities to solve public problems together? And then sort of think about how those experiences can then be laddered up to shape a different experience about what politics can be.
I so agree with that. And I think this problem where, when you ask people which side are they on, and that we do seem very divided in terms of partisanship, right? But then when you ask people, what are the big concerns around here, and what do you think we should do about them, and people come together, right? I think in part it's a big failure of our communication systems, both in social media, and the way in which we engage with people on social media is not about conversation or seeing each other as humans, but these platforms are designed for us to provoke one another. That's how they grab our attention and keep us logged in, right? And so it's partly social media, but I think also, like, the evaporation of local media across the country takes away from people the ability to see maybe national issues, but it doesn't matter, but to see issues that are facing their community as issues facing their community, right? To have a forum in which people are thinking about and addressing what's going on right at their own doorstep. And I think local government, for me, is like a source of great hope, where if people can be re-engaged, like Harry's talking about, actually engage people in the work of democracy, and maybe not even call it politics, right? Just community problem solving. If people can be reminded that it's pretty straightforward how you do that, like, you actually just talk with one another and see each other as human beings. And people, like Harry said, like, if they have ideas about what should change, right, and what should be done, and if they can be not only re-engaged in that, but then show them, like, hey, look at what you just did. It has nothing to do with Democrats and Republicans. It's just about the community. That can, I hope, can restore people's sense of faith in democracy and in this thing that we demonize now that's generally called politics.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. You're both just wonderful. This was wonderful, and welcome to the Rural Assembly. This is something that I'm going to enjoy for a long time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much. And like Harry said, just so great to engage with you both. Really great to have a moment.